He was the kind of man who didn't just own the building, he owned the silence within it. Alistair Finch, heir to the Finch real estate empire, and a name whispered with equal parts reverence and fear in New York's elite circles, was erupting. His voice, a low thunder that promised violence, was directed at a waitress in the dead center of Waitress with the gilded quill, a restaurant so exclusive its reservation list was a state secret. The clinking of crystal silverware ceased. The murmur of billion-dollar deals being brokered over foie gras died in the throats of senators and CEOs. Everyone froze, a gallery of wax figures caught in the amber light of the chandeliers, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the young woman in the black apron. They expected tears. They expected a panicked apology, a retreat. But Clara Maeve did not retreat. Holding a silver tray bearing a single, untouched martini, she looked him directly in the eye. The calm in her gaze was more unnerving than his rage. Then she spoke 6 words that fractured the opulent quiet. "Shout at me again, and this ends." What followed was not the explosion the room anticipated. It was a detonation of a different kind, quieter and far more profound, a seismic shift that would irrevocably alter the landscape of both their lives. The ambient sound inside, the gilded quill, was the rustle of old money. It was the whisper of silk against century-old leather banquettes, the sigh of a sommelier uncorking a vintage Bordeaux, the polite fiction of civility papering over brutal ambition. For Clara Maeve, it was the symphony of her own exhaustion. She adjusted the knot on her apron, catching her reflection in the polished brass of a service station. The woman staring back was a ghost of herself, all sharp angles and deep-set hazel eyes smudged with fatigue. A 12-hour shift was drawing to a close, but rest was a luxury as distant as the constellations. Every dollar from this job, every humiliatingly small tip from men who lit cigars with $100 bills, went into the mounting medical bills for her grandmother's long-term care facility. The image of Nana Rose, her mind a beautiful fading tapestry, was the steel rod that kept Clara's spine erect when her body screamed to fold. "Table 7, Maeve. The Finches. They need another round of scotch. Macallan 25. And for God's sake, try to look like you're not attending a funeral." The voice belonged to Mr. Dubois, the maitre d', a man who wielded condescension as both a tool and a pastime. "Yes, Mr. Dubois," Clara said, her voice a practiced monotone. She tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, a gesture she'd made 1,000 times. In her apron pocket, her fingers brushed against the worn cover of a small paperback book. Masters of Deception, a history of great art forgers. It was her secret escape, a portal to a world she'd once dreamed of inhabiting before life had forced her to trade lecture halls for dining rooms. Table 7 was a vortex. Alistair Finch sat at its head, a man in his mid-30s who wore a bespoke suit like a suit of armor. He was brutally handsome, with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite and eyes the color of a stormy sea. His reputation preceded him, a ruthless negotiator who had doubled his family's fortune by gutting competitors. Tonight, that ruthlessness was curdling into a foul temper. Across from him sat his uncle, Sterling Finch. Sterling was the opposite of Alistair. Smooth where Alistair was sharp, all silver hair, charming smiles, and a voice like warm honey. He was the respected elder statesman of the family, the public face of their philanthropic endeavors. But Clara, who had learned to read people the way she read brushstrokes in a painting, saw something cold and reptilian behind his avuncular mask. "The board is getting nervous, Alistair," Sterling was saying, his voice a placid murmur that barely carried. 200 million is a significant outlay for a single painting, especially one with such a... creative provenance. Alistair's hand tightened around his glass. The Moretti is a masterpiece. It's the capstone for the new Finch Tower lobby. It's a statement. Or it's a folly, Sterling countered gently. Our experts have authenticated it, of course. But you're pushing this through awfully fast. It makes people think you're being reckless. The word reckless was a lit match. Alistair's face darkened. I built the new tower. I secured the zoning. I will choose the art that hangs in its lobby. I don't care what the board thinks. His voice was rising, drawing glances from the adjacent tables. Clara approached with the practiced invisibility of a seasoned server. She waited for a lull, a breath, a moment to step in and perform her duties. They think you're trying to outrun your father's shadow, Sterling pressed, his words a precise, surgical strike. That was it. Alistair slammed his hand on the table. The crystal glasses jumped, the scotch sloshing over the rims. My father would have understood. He knew that power isn't just held, it's displayed. The room flinched. Clara took a steadying breath and moved forward, her steps silent on the thick Persian rug. She reached for Alistair's near-empty glass. Another scotch, Mr. Finch? Alistair's head snapped towards her. His eyes, blazing with a fury meant for his uncle, found her instead. He didn't see a person. He saw an interruption, a nuisance in an apron. Can you not see that I am in the middle of a private conversation? He snarled, his voice cracking like a whip through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. My apologies, sir. Your glass was empty. I was merely— You were merely what? Alistair stood up, his 6'3" frame casting a long, menacing shadow over her. The entire restaurant went dead silent. Even the kitchen staff, visible through the porthole window on the swinging door, had stopped moving. Are you paid to think, or are you paid to pour drinks and disappear? Is that simple task beyond your comprehension? Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The heavy silver tray felt slick in her palm. In the periphery, she saw Mr. Dubois, his face the color of ash, making a frantic cutting motion across his throat. Walk away. Apologize. Disappear. But Clara couldn't. It wasn't just the 12-hour shift or the crushing weight of her grandmother's illness. It was the memory of sitting by Nana Rose's bedside just that morning, showing her pictures in an art book, watching her struggle to recall the name Van Gogh. It was the quiet dignity her grandmother had possessed, even as her mind betrayed her. It was the utter, dismissive contempt in Alistair Finch's eyes, the way he looked at her, as if she were not a person, but a malfunctioning piece of furniture. Get out of my sight, Alistair spat, his hand sweeping through the air in a gesture of violent dismissal. It didn't connect, but she flinched instinctively. It's this kind of incompetence that's rotting this city from the inside out. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Sterling watched with a detached, analytical curiosity. A cold, preternatural calm descended upon Clara. It was the calm of a person pushed past their breaking point, the clarity that comes when there is nothing left to fear, nothing more to lose. She did not retreat. Instead, she took one deliberate step forward, placing the tray with the martini onto the table with a soft, definitive click. She looked up, her 5'6" frame suddenly feeling monumental. She met the billionaire's furious gaze. Shout at me again, she said, her voice low and steady, yet it sliced through the silence like a shard of glass. And this ends. Alistair blinked, the sheer, unmitigated audacity of her words short-circuiting his rage. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the faint smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the way she stood her ground as if she were rooted to the very foundations of the earth. "Excuse me?" he whispered, the word a sibilant threat. "This," Clara clarified, her gaze unwavering, "is a Pissarro. A late-period pointillist imitation, but a very good one." She gestured with her chin toward the massive oil painting that dominated the wall behind their table, a landscape of a Parisian street. "The real Boulevard Montmartre at night hangs in the National Gallery in London. This copy, however, has one fascinating flaw." The entire room, including a baffled Alistair, turned to look at the painting. "The gas lamps," Clara continued, her voice gaining the confident cadence of a lecturer. "The artist who copied it used a cadmium yellow pigment for the glow. Cadmium yellow wasn't commercially available until 3 years after Pissarro painted the original. It's a beautiful, expensive, and entirely fraudulent piece of art." She shifted her gaze back to Alistair, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "You've been dining under a lie, Mr. Finch. You, a man who prides himself on seeing value. It proves that even the most powerful people can be fooled if they aren't paying attention to the details." Her words hung in the air, more shocking than any shouted retort. She hadn't just defied him, she had dismantled him, exposed a crack in his armor of wealth and perception with a quiet, irrefutable fact. Sterling Finch let out a low, appreciative chuckle. Alistair's face, which had been flushed with rage, slowly drained of color, replaced by a complex tapestry of shock, humiliation, and a dawning, grudging respect. He slowly, mechanically, sank back into his chair. He looked at the painting, then back at the waitress who had just intellectually disarmed him in front of his uncle and half of New York's power brokers. He picked up his napkin, unfolded it, and placed it on his lap. He looked at Clara, his stormy eyes now filled with a bewildered curiosity. "Pour the scotch," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't an order. It was a request. Clara didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply retrieved the bottle from her service station, poured a precise measure into his glass, and did the same for his uncle. "Enjoy your evening, gentlemen," she said, her professionalism a perfect, impenetrable shield. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high. She made it through the swinging kitchen doors before her legs turned to water, and she had to brace herself against a stainless steel prep table, her entire body trembling with the adrenaline of a battle she had never intended to fight. The kitchen, usually a cacophony of clanging pans and shouted orders, fell silent as she entered. The chefs paused, whisks hovering mid-air. Mr. Dubois descended upon her, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. "Are you certifiably insane?" he shrieked, grabbing her arm and dragging her towards his tiny, cluttered office. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That was Alistair Finch. He could have this restaurant condemned and turned into a private dog park by morning out of sheer spite. He was screaming at me, Mr. Dubois," Clara said, her voice still shaky. "He was creating a scene. He is allowed to create a scene. He pays for the right to create scenes. You are paid to absorb them." Dubois was pacing, running his hands through his thinning hair. "I'm sorry, Maeve. You're a good worker. But I have to let you go. If he complains, and he will complain, my head will be on a platter if you're still on the clock. It's over." The floor seemed to drop away beneath her, fired for defending her own dignity. The cost of standing up for herself was the very job that kept her grandmother safe. "Mr. Dubois, please. You know about my grandmother. I need the insurance." "I can't," he said, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He pulled a thin envelope of cash from his desk drawer. "Here's what we owe you for the week. Please just go out the back." Clara took the envelope, her fingers numb. There was no point in arguing. She knew the rules of this world. The rich shouted, and the poor were swept away in the echo. In the cramped locker room, she changed out of her uniform and into her worn jeans and faded cardigan. As she pushed open the heavy alley door, the cold, rain-slicked air felt like a slap. Tears she had refused to shed in front of them now burned at the back of her eyes. She pulled out her phone. A text from the nursing home. "Hi, Clara. Just a reminder that Mrs. Rose's account is past due. Please remit payment at your earliest convenience." A sob caught in her throat. She had to be strong. She had to find another way. Head down against the biting wind, she started the long walk toward the subway. "Miss Maeve." The voice, deep and resonant, came from a black Maybach sedan idling silently at the alley's entrance. The tinted rear window glided down. Clara froze, her hand clutching the strap of her tote bag. A chauffeur in a black suit emerged from the driver's side. "Mr. Finch would like a word." Her stomach churned with acid. "He can file his complaint with my former manager. I no longer work there. He won." "He doesn't wish to complain, miss," the driver said, opening the rear passenger door, revealing the cavernous, leather-scented interior. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to get on the train and vanish into the anonymity of the city. But a spark of defiance, the same spark that had made her speak up in the restaurant, held her in place. Inside the car, Alistair Finch sat shrouded in shadow. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her. "I'm not getting in," Clara said, her voice firm from the safety of the sidewalk. "I heard Dubois let you go," Alistair said. His voice was different now, stripped of its earlier rage, replaced by a controlled, almost cautious tone. "I didn't ask him to." "You didn't have to," she retorted. "Men like you are hurricanes. You don't need to touch the houses to tear them down." He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the passing glow of a streetlight. He looked exhausted. The anger had been a mask, and beneath it was a profound, bone-deep weariness. "You're right," he said. The admission stunned her into silence. "My behavior was inexcusable," he continued. "I was under a great deal of pressure. That's an explanation, not an excuse. But that painting, how did you know?" "I studied art history before I had to drop out," she said, shrugging. "I noticed details." "You do more than that," he said, a strange intensity in his voice. "You see things other people miss. You see the truth underneath the polish." He paused, his gaze searching. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Maeve." "A job." Clara let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "A job? Doing what? Polishing your shoes? Or do you need a full-time punching bag?" "I need your eyes," he said, the words sharp and serious. "The painting you identified as a fake is a minor issue, a piece of decoration, but I'm in the process of acquiring another piece, a Renaissance masterpiece called the Moretti Madonna. My company is poised to pay $200 million for it. My uncle is championing the deal. The experts have signed off, but my gut tells me something is wrong with it." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping. "I want to hire you to look at it, to find the flaw, to tell me if I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my career. I need someone who isn't already on my payroll, someone who isn't afraid to tell me I'm being a fool." Clara stared at him, bewildered. This wasn't a PR stunt. This wasn't an apology. It was something far stranger. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Finch, not an art appraiser." "You're the only person who has told me the unvarnished truth in the last 5 years, he countered. "I'll pay you $100,000 for 1 week of your time, full access to my research, my experts, my security. All I ask for is your honest, unfiltered opinion. $100,000. The number was so large it seemed unreal. It was more than just catching up on Nana Rose's bills. It was security. It was peace of mind. It was a future. It was a deal with a man who was arrogant, volatile, and quite possibly unstable. But he was also the first person in a long time who had seen the scholar beneath the server's uniform. "And my grandmother's medical insurance," Clara said, testing him. "I want her on the best plan your company offers. Retroactively." Alistair didn't hesitate. "Done." She looked down the dark, wet street toward the subway, then back at the man who had torn her life apart and was now offering to rebuild it in the most surreal way imaginable. "I have one more condition," she said, her voice gathering strength. A rare ghost of a smile touched Alistair's lips. "I would expect nothing less. You will never, ever speak to me that way again." The smile vanished, replaced by a solemn gravity. "You have my word, Miss Maeve." He gestured to the open door. "Get in the car. Your work starts now." She got in. As the heavy door closed with a silent, definitive thud, sealing her inside the silent, opulent world of the billionaire, Clara knew she hadn't just accepted a job. She had stepped through a looking glass into a world of unimaginable wealth, danger, and deception. And she was terrifyingly, exhilaratingly unprepared for what lay on the other side. The transition from the sticky linoleum floors of a restaurant kitchen to the hushed, climate-controlled halls of Alistair Finch's world was jarring. The next morning, a town car, not a rattling subway train, delivered her to the base of the new Finch Tower, a shard of glass and steel that pierced the Manhattan skyline. Clara walked into the lobby, a cavernous space of white marble and soaring ceilings, feeling like a forgery herself. She wore the only professional outfit she owned, a simple black dress and a cardigan, but surrounded by women in tailored power suits and men whose watches cost more than her grandmother's care for a year, she felt a profound sense of imposter syndrome. A private elevator whisked her to the penthouse floor, which served as Alistair's office and temporary residence. The doors opened not into a reception area, but into a living space that looked like a modern art museum. One entire wall was a window, offering a godlike view of the city below. "You're punctual," Alistair said. He was standing by the window, a tablet in his hand, already dressed in a perfectly fitted grey suit. He looked less like the angry man from the restaurant and more like the formidable CEO from the business journals. "I appreciate that." He led her to a large glass table where several thick binders were laid out. "This is everything we have on the Moretti Madonna. Provenance reports, chemical analysis of the pigments, high-resolution infrared scans, expert authentications. It's all there." Clara ran her hand over the smooth cover of the top binder. It felt like stepping into the dream she'd been forced to abandon. "Where is the painting now?" "In our high-security vault downstairs. We'll go see it later. First, I want you to read. Absorb everything. I want you to find the lie that I can feel but cannot see." He paused, his expression unreadable. "My uncle, Sterling, will be joining us shortly. He's overseeing the acquisition. He'll want to meet you." "Does he know why I'm here?" "I told him I was impressed by your eye for detail and hired you as a consultant for the lobby's aesthetic. It's a half-truth. Sterling appreciates subtlety." Alistair's jaw tightened. "Do not trust him, Clara. He will be charming. He will make you feel like the most important person in the room. It's a performance." Just then, the elevator chimed. Sterling Finch entered, radiating the effortless confidence of a man born to power. He smiled warmly when he saw Clara. "Ah, this must be the young lady with the remarkable eye," he said, extending a hand. "Clara, is it? Sterling Finch, a pleasure. My nephew was so taken with your critique of the restaurant's decor." "Mr. Finch," Clara said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin smooth. "Alistair, I've just come from a call with the Moretti Estate's representatives in Geneva," Sterling said, turning his attention to his nephew. "They're getting anxious. They want to finalize the wire transfer by the end of the week. The unveiling gala is scheduled for Friday night. We can't afford any more delays." "The funds will be transferred when I am satisfied, Uncle," Alistair said coolly. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but his eyes held a glint of steel. "Of course. We just wouldn't want to damage the Finch reputation by appearing indecisive." He turned back to Clara. "Well, my dear, I do hope you can help Alistair with his aesthetic concerns quickly. It would be a shame for a masterpiece to be held up by a matter of taste." He was dismissing her, framing her role as frivolous, unimportant. It was a subtle power play, and Clara felt the sting. For the next 3 days, Clara lived and breathed the Moretti Madonna. She pored over the documents, her old academic instincts taking over. Alistair gave her a small, adjoining office, and staff brought her meals she was too engrossed to eat. She cross-referenced auction records, studied the chemical breakdowns of the gesso and varnish, and spent hours staring at blown-up digital images of the painting, examining every crack and brush stroke. The paperwork was perfect. Too perfect. The provenance traced the painting from a 16th-century Italian monastery through the collection of a French aristocrat, before it vanished during World War II, and resurfaced with a reclusive Swiss family. Every document was stamped, every signature verified. The world's leading experts had all declared it genuine. Yet like Alistair, Clara felt a deep, unsettling wrongness she couldn't articulate. On the 3rd day, Alistair took her down to the vault. The room was cold, stark, and silent. In the center, on a heavy easel, under a single, perfectly calibrated light, was the painting. It was breathtaking. A portrait of the Madonna, her face a study in serene sorrow, her blue robes so vibrant they seemed to hum with color. The artistry was undeniable. Clara walked around it, her heart pounding. She felt the weight of Alistair's gaze on her, waiting. She looked for hours, trying to find the anachronistic pigment, the modern brush stroke, the single tell that would unravel the entire story. But there was nothing. The technique was flawless. The aging was consistent. The canvas was period-appropriate. "I don't see it," she finally whispered, a wave of disappointment and failure washing over her. "It's perfect." Alistair's shoulders slumped slightly. "So my gut is wrong?" "Maybe," Clara said, still staring at the Madonna's face. There was something in the eyes, a sadness that felt almost familiar. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "Maybe it's real." That evening, feeling defeated, Clara took a break and visited her grandmother. She found Nana Rose sitting by the window, looking out at the gardens. "Hello, Nana," Clara said softly, kissing her wrinkled cheek. "Clara, my love," her grandmother said, her eyes lighting up with a moment of pure clarity. "Did you bring your books?" Clara smiled and pulled the worn paperback from her bag. For the next hour, she showed her grandmother pictures of paintings, just as she had done 100 times before. She turned to a page featuring the work of Han van Meegeren, the infamous 20th-century forger who had tricked the Nazis. He was a genius, wasn't he? Clara mused. He didn't just copy Vermeer. He created entirely new Vermeers, painting them in a way he imagined the master would have. He understood the soul of the artist. Nana Rose pointed a trembling finger at one of Van Meegeren's forgeries, a painting of Christ. "Sad eyes," she whispered, "like the man in your locket." Clara froze. She touched the small, silver locket she always wore, a gift from her parents before they died. Inside was a tiny photograph of her father. "What did you say, Nana?" "His eyes," her grandmother repeated, her voice drifting as the fog of her illness rolled back in. "So sad. Just like that painting. He always looked so sad after your mother." Her voice trailed off. Clara's mind raced. Sad eyes. The soul of the artist. She flipped frantically through her book, her heart beginning to pound with a new, wild idea. She found the section on a lesser-known but brilliant Italian forger from the 1950s, a man named Lorenzo Vespari. Vespari was famous for not copying existing works, but for creating entirely new pieces in the style of Renaissance masters. His signature, according to the book, was emotional anachronism. He painted his subjects with a distinctly 20th century melancholy, a post-war weariness that a 16th century artist could never have conceived. His own wife had died tragically young, and he imbued all his female figures with her profound, sorrowful gaze. The Madonna in the vault, the serene sorrow. It wasn't the piety of the Renaissance, it was the grief of a modern man. "Nana, you're a genius," Clara whispered, kissing her grandmother's head. She raced out of the nursing home, her mind on fire. She didn't go back to her office. She went to the main Finch corporate archives, a place she wasn't supposed to have access to. Flashing the all-access badge Alistair had given her, she bluffed her way past the night archivist. "Mr. Finch needs the complete acquisition files for all major art purchases made in the last 50 years, she said, her voice firm. She wasn't looking for information on the Moretti. She was looking for something else. For hours she sifted through dusty boxes, her hands growing grimy, and then she found it. A file from 30 years ago, for the purchase of a small Renaissance sculpture. The acquisition had been overseen by a young Sterling Finch. The authentication expert he had used, the one who had vouched for the piece, was a little-known European consultant. His name was Lorenzo Vespari. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. Sterling and Vespari had a history. This wasn't a new deception. It was an old one, perfected over decades. The Moretti Madonna wasn't a copy. It was an original Vespari, a masterpiece of forgery, created specifically for this sale, and Sterling Finch was the architect of the entire fraud. He wasn't just pushing the deal through, he had orchestrated it from the very beginning, planning to defraud his own family's company of $200 million. Clara grabbed the file and ran. She had to get to Alistair. But as she exited the archives, a figure stepped out of the shadows of the hallway, blocking her path. It was Sterling. His warm smile was gone, replaced by an expression of reptilian coldness. "Looking for something, my dear?" he asked, his voice no longer honeyed, but sharp and dangerous. "I must say, Alistair was a fool to think a little waitress could unravel a lifetime of work. You should have stayed in your place." Two large men in dark suits moved to stand behind him. Clara's blood ran cold. She clutched the file to her chest. She had found the truth, but it seemed she had found it too late. The air in the hallway crackled with menace. Sterling took a slow step forward, his polished shoes silent on the marble floor. "That file is company property, Clara," he said, his voice a low, chilling purr. "And you are no longer a company consultant. You're a trespasser. A thief." "I know about Vespari," Clara said, her voice shaking but defiant. She held the file tighter. "I know you used him 30 years ago. This Moretti painting, it's his work, isn't it? He made it for you." Sterling's mask of civility dropped completely. A flicker of genuine fury crossed his face before being replaced by cold amusement. "You are clever," he admitted. "Far more than I gave you credit for. Lorenzo was a true artist, a genius, really. It's a pity the world never recognized his talent. He passed away last year. But this Madonna was his magnum opus, his final masterpiece." "It's a fraud," Clara shot back, "and you're about to steal $200 million from your own nephew." "Business is business," Sterling said with a dismissive shrug. "Alistair is weak, sentimental. He lacks the vision his father had. He's running the Finch empire into the ground with his caution. This money in my hands will build real power. He sees art. I see assets." He gestured to the two men behind him. "Now be a good girl and give me the file. We can handle this quietly. A generous severance package, a non-disclosure agreement. You can disappear and take excellent care of your grandmother for the rest of her life." It was a tempting offer, a lifeline, a way out. But Clara looked at the cold, predatory gleam in Sterling's eyes and saw the same dismissive contempt Alistair had shown her in the restaurant, magnified 100 times. It was the casual cruelty of the powerful, the belief that everything and everyone had a price. "No," she said. Sterling sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "A pity. I truly hoped you were more pragmatic." He nodded to his men. "Take it from her." Clara didn't scream. She acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she spun around and hurled the heavy file down the long, empty hallway. It skittered across the polished floor, papers spilling out in a chaotic wake. As the two men instinctively turned toward the noise, she bolted in the opposite direction, her worn-out flats slapping against the marble. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get to Alistair. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to dial his number. The men were recovering, their heavy footsteps echoing behind her. She rounded a corner and saw a service elevator, its doors sliding open. Without thinking, she dove inside, frantically pressing the button for the penthouse. The doors started to close. A large hand shot through the gap, forcing them open again. One of the guards lunged for her. She slammed her shoulder against the door close button, and with a groan of protest, the heavy steel doors slid shut, trapping the man's arm for a split second before he yanked it back with a curse. The elevator began its ascent. Clara leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, her heart feeling like it would beat its way out of her chest. She had the proof, but Sterling knew she had it. The gala, the grand unveiling of the painting, was tomorrow night. It was no longer just about exposing a forgery. It was a race. When the elevator opened, she stumbled out directly into Alistair's living space. He was on the phone, pacing, his back to her. "I don't care what the board says," he was barking into the receiver. "We are not wiring the funds until I give the final say. Do you understand me?" "Alistair," she gasped. He spun around, his face a mask of frustration that immediately melted into alarm when he saw her state. "Clara, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," she said, her voice ragged. "I've seen your uncle." Quickly, breathlessly, she explained everything. Vespari, the file from the archives, the connection to Sterling, the confrontation in the hallway. As she spoke, Alistair's face went from confusion to disbelief, and finally settled into a cold, hard fury that was terrifying to behold. He didn't explode. He went unnervingly still. He would betray the family, Alistair said, the words barely a whisper. His own brother's legacy. For money. He looked at Clara, his stormy eyes filled with a new, profound respect. "I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my bones. But you found it. You saw the truth." He walked to the massive window, looking down at the city lights. The gala is tomorrow night. Sterling will be expecting me to back out, to cancel it. He'll have a contingency plan. He'll discredit you, call you a disgruntled employee, a fantasist. He'll bury us in litigation and doubt. So what do we do? Clara asked, her fear giving way to a strange resolve. Alistair turned from the window, a dangerous glint in his eye. We don't cancel a thing, he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. We let the party go on. We let him walk onto the stage, bask in the glory of his magnificent acquisition. We let the entire world watch. He looked at Clara. And then you and I are going to burn him to the ground in front of everyone. The night of the Finch Tower Gala was a blizzard of flashing cameras and manufactured glamour. The elite of New York, a glittering river of jewels and couture, flowed into the grand, cathedral-like lobby. At the center of the room, on a velvet-draped stage, stood a large object shrouded in a sheet of black silk. The Moretti Madonna. Clara stood in the wings, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Alistair had insisted she trade her simple dress for an elegant, understated emerald gown. Tonight you are not a consultant, he had told her. You are my partner. The dress felt like a costume, but the look in his eyes when he'd seen her in it had felt disarmingly real. She watched as Sterling Finch moved through the crowd, a conquering hero. He accepted congratulations, shook hands with the mayor, and laughed with art critics who were already preparing their glowing reviews. He looked completely at ease, utterly confident. He caught Clara's eye from across the room and gave her a small, pitying smile, as if she were a foolish child who didn't know the game was already over. Alistair appeared at her side, handing her a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. Nervous? He asked, his voice low. Terrified, she admitted. What if they don't believe me? I'm just a waitress. He's Sterling Finch. You're the woman who saw a fake Pissarro from 20 feet away, Alistair said, his gaze steady and reassuring. You have the truth on your side. That's more power than he could ever buy. He touched her arm lightly. I'll be right there with you. The speeches began. The mayor extolled the Finch family's profound contribution to the city's cultural landscape. The esteemed director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art lauded the miraculous discovery of a lost Renaissance masterpiece. Then, Sterling Finch, silver-haired and resplendent in a tuxedo that seemed woven from charisma itself, ascended the stage to a wave of thunderous applause. Thank you, he began, his voice a perfectly modulated instrument of command and grace. Art, you see, is more than mere paint on a canvas. It is our history. It is our shared legacy. And tonight, we are profoundly honored to welcome a piece of that legacy back into the light. He paused, his gaze finding Alistair in the front row, a look of magnanimous indulgence on his face. I want to thank my brilliant nephew, Alistair, for his bold vision. It is his unwavering leadership that has made this momentous acquisition possible. It was a final, exquisitely public twist of the knife, a masterstroke designed to lash Alistair irrevocably to the mast of the fraud. If the ship went down, its captain would be Alistair Finch. And now, Sterling declared, his voice swelling to fill the cavernous lobby, the moment we have all been waiting for. I give you the Moretti Madonna. With a theatrical flourish, he seized the corner of the black silk sheet and swept it away. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. A wave of hushed, reverent silence followed, as hundreds of the world's most powerful people stared, captivated. The painting was, by any measure, magnificent. It glowed under the stage lights, a jewel of impossible artistry. The Madonna's sad, soulful eyes seemed to gaze out at them, a beacon of serene and timeless beauty. Sterling beamed, his chest swelling as he bathed in the reflected glory of the masterpiece, his masterpiece. We will now proceed with the ceremonial signing of the final acquisition documents, officially making this treasure a permanent part of New York's cultural heritage. He gestured for Alistair to join him. Alistair moved with a deliberate, almost unnerving calm, ascending the steps to the stage, his face an unreadable mask of granite. A sleek mahogany table bearing the final contracts was brought out by an assistant. "This is it," Alistair whispered, his lips barely moving as he passed Clara in the wings. "Wait for my signal." He stood beside his uncle, the multi-million-dollar contracts, and a single elegant fountain pen laid out before him. He surveyed the crowd, let his gaze rest on the painting for a long moment, and then turned to face Sterling. "Before I sign," Alistair said, his voice amplified by the microphone, each word ringing with crystalline clarity through the silent lobby, "there is someone else whose contribution tonight deserves the highest recognition. A person whose unique insight and unwavering integrity were instrumental to this entire process. Miss Clara Maeve, would you please join us?" A spotlight, sharp and unforgiving, swung through the darkness and found Clara. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Who was she? Sterling's practiced smile tightened at the edges, the first visible crack in his perfect facade. This was not in his script. Clara walked onto the stage, her legs feeling like they were made of lead, the emerald silk of her gown whispering against the floor. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, 1,000 questions. She came to a stop beside Alistair, facing the sea of powerful, curious and skeptical faces. "Miss Maeve," Alistair continued, his tone now that of a lecturer in a quiet seminar, "possesses an extraordinary eye for detail, an eye that sees what others miss. And she has noticed something quite remarkable about this masterpiece, something that all of our highly paid, world-renowned experts somehow overlooked." He turned to her, his stormy eyes conveying a universe of trust. "Clara." This was her moment, the culmination of a life spent in the quiet company of books, of a mind honed by observation. She took a deep, steadying breath. Her voice, when it came, was quiet at first, but it carried the unshakable weight of truth. "The Moretti Madonna is a stunning work of art," she began, her voice gaining strength and clarity with every word. "It is, without a shadow of a doubt, a masterpiece. But it is not a masterpiece from the 16th century." A shocked, scandalized gasp swept through the lobby. It was the sound of dogma being shattered. Sterling's face went rigid, his complexion turning the color of old parchment. "This painting," Clara declared, her voice ringing now, pointing a steady hand toward the canvas, "is a masterpiece of deception. A brilliant, breathtaking fraud painted in the 20th century by an unheralded genius of forgery named Lorenzo Vespari." "This is utterly absurd," Sterling boomed, stepping forward to wrest control, his voice a desperate thunderclap. "This young woman is a disgruntled former employee, a fantasist with a history of bizarre claims. Security, please escort her from the stage." "Let her speak," Alistair commanded. The words were not shouted, but they sliced through his uncle's blustering with the cold, final authority of a judge's gavel. Clara's confidence surged. She was no longer a waitress. She was an expert in her field. Vespari had a signature, an emotional fingerprint he couldn't help but leave on his work. She pressed on, her voice resonating with academic passion. He imbued all his figures with a distinctly modern sense of melancholy, a quiet sorrow born from his own profound personal grief. The sorrow in this Madonna's eyes is not the pious, devotional grief of the Renaissance. It is the existential, world-weary grief of a 20th century man who has lived through 2 world wars and lost the love of his life. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But you don't have to take my word for it. She glanced at Alistair, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod to a technician in the wings. On the massive screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the Finch corporate logo, a new image flared to life, a high-resolution, impossibly magnified photograph of a tiny section of the Madonna's sublime blue robe. Our own Finch Labs conducted a final, microscopic pigment analysis this afternoon, at my request, Alistair announced, his voice like ice. They found trace elements of phthalocyanine blue, a beautiful, stable, synthetic pigment. It was invented in 1935. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, a vacuum. It was the sound of a $200 million lie imploding, of a carefully constructed reality collapsing into dust. Sterling's face was a deathly, waxen white. He looked from the screen to Alistair, his mouth opening and closing silently. "This is a conspiracy, a fabrication, a lie," he stammered, his voice a ragged whisper. "Is it?" Alistair's voice was devoid of all emotion, a chilling, flat calm. "Or is it precisely the same kind of fabrication you orchestrated 30 years ago, when you first collaborated with Lorenzo Vespari to authenticate a sculpture for this very company? A trial run, perhaps, for your magnum opus of deceit?" On the screen, the image changed again. A document appeared, crisp and damning, the file Clara had found deep within the archives. Sterling's flamboyant signature was clearly visible at the bottom, right next to the elegant, spidery script of Lorenzo Vespari. It was over. Utterly, irrevocably over. Sterling stared at the screen, at the ghost of his past sin, resurrected to destroy his present. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, no longer adoring, but staring back with a mixture of shock, pity, and cold, merciless contempt. He was no longer Sterling Finch, the philanthropist, the statesman of the art world. He was a fraud, a common thief in a bespoke suit. His entire life, a lifetime spent curating a reputation for unimpeachable class and integrity, had been annihilated in a single, devastating moment. He turned, a man suddenly aged by decades, and stumbled off the stage, disappearing into the erupting chaos as a pack of reporters surged forward, their voices a cacophony of shouted questions. Alistair placed a steadying hand on Clara's shoulder. He didn't look at the pandemonium, at the implosion of his family's name. He looked only at her, his eyes filled with a raw, complex emotion she couldn't begin to name. It was more than gratitude. It was awe. It was reverence. "She saved us," Alistair said into the microphone, his voice resonating with a quiet, profound power that silenced the room. "Miss Maeve saved this company, and its honor, from a catastrophic mistake. Not our experts, not our board of directors, but a woman with integrity, intelligence, and the courage to pay attention to the details." He let the unsigned contract slip from his fingers. It fluttered to the table, a meaningless piece of paper. Then he turned his back on the fraudulent masterpiece and, with his hand gently guiding Clara, led her off the stage as the lobby finally detonated into a full-blown pandemonium of flashing lights and shouting voices. The aftermath was not a storm, it was a Category 5 hurricane. The headlines were brutal. "Finch forgery fiasco. Uncle's deceit rocks Finch empire." The company's stock hemorrhaged value. The board of directors was in a state of apoplectic panic. Sterling Finch, after a futile 24-hour attempt to vanish, was apprehended by federal agents while attempting to board a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty. The global art world was reeling, its most trusted experts humiliated, their reputations in tatters. Days later, in the soundproofed sanctuary of Alistair's penthouse, the chaos of the world below was a distant, muted roar. The fraudulent Madonna was gone, seized as federal evidence, leaving an empty space on the wall that felt more honest than the painting ever had. Alistair poured 2 glasses of Macallan 25, the same scotch from that first, fateful night. He handed one to Clara. The haunted, restless weariness that had always clung to him like a shroud was gone. In its place was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But it was the exhaustion of a soldier after a war is won, not the weariness of a man running from his own shadow. "The board is demanding my resignation," he said, his voice flat as he swirled the amber liquid. "They're convening an emergency meeting tomorrow. They say I've brought shame and ridicule upon the family name, that I've irrevocably damaged the brand by airing our dirty laundry in public." "You saved the brand," Clara corrected him softly, her fingers tracing the condensation on her glass. "You saved $200 million. But more than that, you exposed a rot that was eating the company from the inside out. You chose a painful truth over a comfortable, catastrophic lie." "We chose the truth," he corrected her, his gaze intense. "None of this would have happened without you, Clara. I would have eventually felt the lie. But you gave it a name. You gave it a history." He took a sip of his whiskey. "The payment for your consultancy was wired this morning. The full amount, plus a bonus that I hope you'll find appropriate for services rendered under extreme duress." Clara nodded, a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. It was a mixture of profound relief and an equally profound sadness. Her grandmother was safe, her future financially secure beyond her wildest dreams. Her work was done. It was time to step back through the looking glass, back into her own life. "I went to the registrar's office at Columbia yesterday," she said, the words feeling both momentous and small. "I paid my tuition for the next 3 years, in full. I'm re-enrolling for the spring semester. I'm going to finish my degree, finally." "Good," Alistair said, his voice quiet, almost rough with an unidentifiable emotion. "That's very good. They'll be lucky to have you." An immense, awkward silence stretched between them, thick with everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. He was a billionaire CEO, now facing the battle of his corporate life. She was, once again, a student who, just over a week ago, had been a waitress. Their worlds had collided with the force of a supernova, creating a new reality. But now the laws of physics seemed to be reasserting themselves, pulling them back into their separate, preordained orbits. "Well," she said, setting her half-empty glass down on the marble coaster, with a soft click. "I should go." "Clara, wait." He moved to stand in front of her, blocking her path to the door. He looked not like a captain of industry, but like a man lost at sea. "What you did, it wasn't just about the painting. You held up a mirror. To my company, to my family, to me. That night in the restaurant, the man I was, I never want to be him again." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of such uncharacteristic vulnerability, it made her breath catch. "Tomorrow I'm going to walk into that boardroom. They expect me to be my father's son, ruthless, pragmatic, willing to cut a deal to make the scandal disappear. They expect me to be the man who shouted at you. But I'm going to fight them. I'm not just going to rebuild this company. I'm going to tear it down to the foundations and build something new, something transparent, something worthy of my father's real legacy, not the one Sterling twisted into a lie." He looked at her then, his stormy eyes searching her face, pleading, "This doesn't have to be the end of our work together." "I'm not a consultant, Alistair," she said gently, her heart aching with a strange tenderness. "My place is in a library, surrounded by dusty books, not in a boardroom surrounded by sharks." "I know," he said, a pained expression crossing his face. "God, I know that. I'm not offering you a job." He hesitated, the next word seeming foreign and difficult on his tongue. "I'm asking you to have dinner with me, not as a consultant, not as a partner in crime, not as a savior, just as Clara. And I, for once, will try to be just, Alistair." A slow, genuine smile spread across Clara's face, warming her from the inside out. The man who had once dismissed her as a malfunctioning piece of furniture was now asking, quietly and humbly, for her time. The power dynamic had not just been leveled, it had been shattered and remade into something new, something based on a respect that had been forged in fire. "I think," she said, her own eyes sparkling with a light he had helped ignite, "I can make room in my schedule for that." Months later, the Finch Tower still stood, a gleaming monument against the crisp autumn sky. Alistair, against all odds and expert predictions, had not only survived the boardroom coup, but had emerged victorious. He had purged the old guard, initiated a radical restructuring of the company, and shocked the financial world by doing so with brutal, unvarnished honesty. His first major act as the undisputed head of the new Finch Global was to establish the Vespari Foundation, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to providing museums, galleries, and private collectors with free access to the most advanced authentication technology on the planet, ensuring that beauty and truth would forever walk hand in hand. On a brilliant October afternoon, he walked across the sun-dappled campus of Columbia University, the crunch of fallen leaves under his shoes a soothing rhythm. He found Clara not in a lecture hall, but sitting on a worn wooden bench under a magnificent canopy of golden maple leaves, a heavy art history textbook open on her lap. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was easy, bright, and utterly genuine. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, and she had never looked more beautiful or more powerful. She was no longer a waitress adrift in a world of suffocating wealth, but a scholar in her own rightful element. He sat down beside her, not as the billionaire CEO, but as a man who was slowly, painstakingly, learning the fundamental difference between price and value. Their story hadn't ended with a dramatic, storybook kiss at a gala. It was being written in the quiet, steady, and often difficult work of rebuilding. He was rebuilding an empire into an institution of integrity. She was rebuilding the dream that life had forced her to abandon. And together, slowly, carefully, over dinners that lasted for hours and conversations that delved into everything from pigment analysis to the crushing weight of legacy, they were building a foundation of their own. It was a foundation based not on a whirlwind romance, but on a hard-won, deeply ingrained, mutual respect. He hadn't rescued the waitress from her life of struggle. The waitress had, in every single way that truly mattered, rescued him from his.